The Loyalist fleet descended like a storm of metal and light. Dozens of ships surrounding the small ranger station, until the sky itself seemed to disappear behind there. Hull's General Korath was the first to emerge from the command vessel. A massive Kalori with silver fur and scars that told stories of countless battles. And his eyes swept the scene with cold calculation. Yuna watched from where she lay against the boulder. Too wounded to move, as the general approached Steven with a bow that seemed more formal than warm, Your Highness. Korath said in common so that everyone could understand, "We have searched for 3 days. The Dominion rejoices that you live Saven stood tall, despite the exhaustion that showed in every line of the heir's small-bodied general. The heir said, "This human saved my life. She pulled me from the river and fought the assassins alone. She must be given medical care immediately." Korath's eyes moved to Yuna, and something flickered there that made her skin crawl even through the haze of pain. "Of course, Your Highness," the general said smoothly. "We will see to everything." But he made no move to help her. And his soldiers stood in formation without approaching. And Yuna began to understand that something was very wrong. The general turned back to Steven, and his voice dropped lower, though Yuna could still hear every word. "Your Highness, we must discuss what happened here." "The implications are complex. What is there to discuss?" Steven asked. "The assassins are dead, and I am alive thanks to this human. That is precisely the problem," Korath said, and there was no warmth in his voice now. Only cold political calculation. Yuna watched as the general stepped closer to Steven. Looming over the small heir with his massive frame, the galaxy cannot know that the crown, heir of the Kalori Dominion, was saved by a human. He said, "It would undermine everything we have built. Generations of teaching our people that humans are inferior, primitive, unworthy of respect." Steven stepped back with shock, written clearly across those feline features. "You cannot be serious." The heir said, "I am completely serious, Your Highness," Korath replied. "The Council of Elders has already discussed this matter. The official story will be that loyal Kalari guards saved you from the assassins. The human involvement will be erased, and what of the human herself?" Steven asked in a voice that had gone dangerously quiet. Korath did not answer, but his hand moved to the weapon at his side. "And that was answer enough, no?" Steven said firmly. "I forbid this. You are the heir, Your Highness," Korath said with something like pity. "But you are not yet the ruler. The council makes these decisions, not you." Yuna laughed, and the sound made everyone turn to look at her. "What is amusing human?" Korath demanded. "You are," Yuna said through teeth gritted against the pain. "You really think you can make this disappear?" The general's eyes narrowed. "You are wounded and alone." He said, "Your people do not even know you are in danger. There is nothing you can do." Yuna smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. "I am a wilderness ranger, General," she said, "and when rangers encounter emergency situations, we follow protocol. Which means I have been broadcasting on open channels since the moment those assassins landed." The silence that followed was absolute. Every human colony in the sector heard what happened here. Yuna continued, "Every Galactic Council frequency. And unless I am mistaken, the Kalori civilian bands as well." She watched the color drain from Korath's silver fur. "Millions of people heard me fight your assassins," she said. "Millions more heard your heir thank me for saving their life. And right now, millions are hearing you threaten to kill us both to protect your propaganda." Korath spun to his communications officer. "Jam all frequencies," he ordered. "Now it is too late, General," the officer said with a trembling voice. "The broadcast has been running for over an hour. It has already been recorded and shared across the network. Trying to stop it now would only confirm everything." Zaven stepped forward, and there was something new in the heir's bearing. Something that looked almost like a ruler. "Give me the communicator," Steven commanded. And the officer handed it over without hesitation. The heir looked at Yuna for a long moment, and something passed between them that did not need words. Then Steven spoke into the communicator. And the words went out to every Kalari who could hear them, people of the Dominion. The heir said, I am Stephen of the First Pride, your crown heir. And I speak to you now from a human ranger station on Vareth 7, where I nearly died today. The heir's voice grew stronger with every word. 3 days ago, the Council of Shadows tried to assassinate me, and I fled into the wilderness where I fell into a river and nearly drowned because I never learned to swim. Stephen paused, and the glowing markings pulsed with emotion. A human saved me. The heir continued, a human named Unibeak, who did not know who I was, who gained nothing from the act, who jumped into dangerous water and risked her life for a stranger of a species that has shown her people nothing but contempt. Kareth was frozen, unable to act, unwilling to silence the heir. While the galaxy listened, she asked for nothing. Stephen said she expected nothing, and when assassins came to kill me, she fought them alone. 8 elite warriors against 1 human ranger. And she won. The heir's voice cracked with emotion. I watched a human bleed for me. The heir said, and when the killing blow was about to fall, I took a life to save hers. The first blood I have ever shed, and I would do it again without hesitation. Stephen looked directly at General Karathno. I stand here watching my own people threaten to murder us both to hide the truth. And I ask you, my people, is this who we are? Is this what the Dominion has become? The silence stretched across 1,000 worlds. If the humans are truly inferior, Stephen said quietly, then why are we so afraid to admit that one of them saved my life? Kareth finally moved, drawing his weapon and pointing it at the communicator in Stephen's hand. Enough. The general said, this has gone too far. The council will not allow. I do not care what the council allows. Stephen interrupted, and for the first time the heir sounded truly royal. I care about truth. I care about honor. And I care about the woman bleeding on the ground, who deserves better than Thiskareth's weapon trembled, but did not fire. You would start a war with humanity over 1 ranger. He asked I would burn the Dominion to ash before I let you kill someone who saved my life. Stephen replied, and every word was a blade. The standoff held for a heartbeat that felt like eternity. Then Kareth made his decision. He pressed the control on his communicator and spoke to his fleet target, the ranger station. He ordered, prepare to fire on my command, General. No. Someone shouted, but Kareth was beyond listening. The heir has been compromised. He announced to his soldiers, corrupted by human influence. The Council of Elders will understand that this was necessary. Yuna looked up at the ships overhead, at the weapons powering up, at the small Kalori heir standing between her and death with nothing but words and courage. It had been a good life, she thought, and at least she had spent the end of it doing something that mattered. Then the sky split open with new light, and everything changed. The ships came down fast and hard, landing in the clearing beyond the ranger station with a roar of engines that shook the walls and rattled the windows. Yuna counted 8 Kalori warriors emerging from the first shuttle, all of them armed with weapons that glowed with deadly energy. And she knew immediately from their black armor that these were not the loyalist assassins. Stephen whispered from the bed. The Council of Shadows sent their best. Yuna had already moved to her weapons locker, pulling out the rifle she kept for emergencies and checking its charge with practiced hands. Can you walk? She asked. Stephen tried to stand and nearly collapsed. Legs still too weak from the ordeal in the river. I cannot fight. The Kalori said with shame in every word, I have never been taught. Royalty is protected, not protecting. Then stay here and stay quiet, Yuna said. I will handle this. Avon grabbed her arm with clawed fingers that did not scratch this time. There are 8 of them. The heir said, elite warriors trained since birth to kill. You cannot possibly win against such odds. Yuna smiled grimly as she loaded extra charge packs into her belt. Probably not, she said, but I am not going to hand you over to people who want to kill you. So I guess we will see what happens. She moved to the door and then paused. Looking back at the small creature wrapped in blankets who wore glowing markings of royalty, "Why are you doing this?" Steven asked, and the question was the same one as before, but somehow different now. Heavier with meaning. Yuna thought about it for a moment. "Because you were drowning," she said, "and I was there. And as far as I am concerned, that has not changed." She slipped out the door before Steven could respond. Night air was cold and the assassins were spreading out in a tactical formation that told Yuna they knew exactly what they were doing. She moved through the shadows around her station, using terrain she had walked 1,000 times to stay hidden while she planned her defense. The leader of the assassins called out an accented Galactic Common Human Ranger. "We know the air is inside. Give them to us and you will not be harmed. Resist and you will die. This is your only warning." Yuna answered with a shot that took down the warrior on the left flank. And then she was moving before they could track her position. The assassins returned fire, and the night lit up with energy bolts that scorched the trees and blasted chunks from the rocks. But Yuna was not where they were shooting. She had set traps during her years at this station. Simple things meant for dangerous wildlife. But they worked just as well on Kalori warriors who did not know the ground. One assassin fell into a pit and impaled himself on stakes. Another triggered a snare that yanked him into the air, where Yuna shot him before he could cut himself free. 3 down and 5 to go. And Yuna knew her luck would not hold forever. The assassins adapted quickly, moving more carefully now. And one of them managed to flank her position while she was reloading. The energy bolt caught her in the shoulder, and she went down hard, biting back a scream as pain exploded through her body. She rolled behind a boulder and fired back, catching the assassin in the chest. But another bolt hit her leg, and suddenly she could not run anymore. 4 down and 4 to go. And Yuna was bleeding badly from wounds that her medical training told her were serious. She limped toward the station, trying to draw the remaining assassins away from Steven. But they were too smart for that trick. 2 of them circled around to cut her off, while the other 2 headed for the door. And Yuna realized with cold certainty that she was about to fail. She shot one of the warriors, blocking her path, and took another bolt to her side for her trouble. And then she was on the ground with the last nearby assassin standing over her with his weapon pointed at her head. "Foolish human," the assassin said, "dying for a Kalori who would not have done the same for. Maybe not." Yuna gasped through the pain. "But that is not really the point, is it?" The assassin snarled and raised his weapon for the killing blow. The blade came out of nowhere, a flash of ceremonial gold that buried itself in the assassin's throat. And the warrior collapsed with a gurgling sound that faded quickly into silence. 7 stood behind the fallen assassin, trembling and wide-eyed and holding a bloody knife that must have been hidden somewhere in those royals. The air's glowing markings were blazing, bright enough to light up the clearing. And Yuna could see tears streaming down the Kalori's feline face. "I could not let them kill you," Steven said in a voice that shook with shock and fear. "Not after everything you did for me." Yuna tried to stand and failed. So she settled for propping herself against the boulder. The other 2 assassins, she said. Steven looked toward the station where the sounds of combat had gone silent. "I do not know." The air said they waited in terrible suspense until 2 figures emerged from the station. And Yuna raised her rifle with arms that could barely hold the weight. But the figures were not moving like assassins. They were limping and supporting each other. And when they got closer, Yuna saw the different armor, the loyal colors of the Crown Guard. "Your Highness," one of the guards called out, "we tracked the assassins here. We feared we were too late." Savan ran to them, and there was a rapid conversation in Kalori that Yuna could not follow. But she caught the tone of relief and joy, and something like awe when the guards looked at her. "The human protected you," one guard said in common. "A human fought 8 shadow warriors alone." "Not alone," Steven said quietly. And the heir looked at the knife still clutched in royal hands. At the blood of the assassin staining that glowing fur, the guards stared at their heir with expressions that Yuna could not read. And then one of them spoke into a communicator in urgent till more ships appeared on the horizon, larger ones this time. And Saban's markings flickered with what might have been hope or might have been fear. "The Loyalist fleet," the heir said. "General Karath is coming, Yuna." Let her rifle fall and slumped against the boulder, because she had nothing left to give. "That is good, right?" she asked. "That means you are safe." Saban looked at her with those golden eyes, and the expression there was complicated in ways Yuna did not understand. "I do not know," the heir said softly. "I truly do not know." The storm hit on the third day, and it hit hard Park. Jisoo had been working since before dawn, and her muscles ached and her lungs burned from breathing the thin air, but she did not stop. She could see the wall of dust and wind approaching across the plain, and she knew that she had only hours to prepare. The shelter she had built over the past 2 days was not enough. The walls were too thin and the roof was not secure, and there were gaps everywhere that the wind would tear apart. She needed to reinforce everything, and she needed to do it fast. Jisoo ran to the junk pile, and she grabbed every support strut she could find from the wrecked Dronaki cargo hauler. The struts were bent and twisted, but they were still strong, and she dragged them back to her shelter one by one. She braced them against the inside of her walls at angles that would distribute the force of the wind across the entire structure. Her grandmother had taught her this principle when she was just a child. A straight wall breaks. Her grandmother had said, "A braced wall bends but holds." Next, she climbed onto the roof frame and she began adjusting the angle of the Methri hull plates. She had originally laid them flat, but now she tilted them so that they sloped downward toward the direction of the approaching storm. The wind would hit the plates and slide over them instead of pushing against them. It was the same principle that made old Korean roofs curve upward at the edges, and Jisoo whispered a thank you to Waim Fispud, her ancestors, as she worked. The gaps in the walls were the biggest problem. She had run out of solid materials, and she had nothing left to fill the spaces between her makeshift bricks and panels. Then she remembered the insulation foam. She had found containers of Krishi insulation foam scattered throughout the junk pile, and she had set them aside because the foam had hardened and become useless for its original purpose. But hardened foam could be ground into powder. Jisoo grabbed handfuls of the brittle foam and she smashed it against rocks until it broke apart into fine particles. Then she mixed the powder with water from her ration supply, and she created a thick paste that she could spread into the gaps. It was a desperate measure, and she hated using her precious water this way, but she had no choice. The paste filled the gaps, and as it dried, it hardened into a seal that would keep out the worst of the wind and dust. The storm arrived at midday. The sky turned brown, and the wind screamed across the plain, and Jisoo retreated into her shelter and pulled a makeshift door closed behind her. The cabin shook. The walls groaned and creaked, and she could hear the wind tearing at the roof above her head. Dust forced its way through tiny gaps she had missed, and she covered her face with a strip of fabric torn from her clothing. For the first 3 hours she did not think she would survive every gust of wind made the structure shudder, and she could feel the support struts straining against the force. But they held. The bracing held, and the angled roof deflected the wind, and the sealed walls kept out most of the dust. Her cabin was not comfortable, but it was standing. Jisoo sat in the center of the small space, and she ate a ration bar, and she listened to the storm rage outside. She found the Vellani manual she had salvaged on the first day, and she opened it to the pages with pictures of Vellani homes. The Vellani built beautiful structures with flowing curves and elegant proportions, and everything was designed to exact specifications. Her cabin looked nothing like that. Her cabin was ugly and patched together and held together with desperation and stubbornness, but her cabin was still standing. In the observation room aboard the station, Professor Felix Tarn watched the storm engulf the human shelter, and he waited for it to collapse. "The structure cannot withstand this," he announced. "The materials are incompatible and the construction is primitive." Coordinator Yulani did not respond because she was watching the sensor data that showed the internal temperature of the shelter. It was warm inside. Somehow the human had created insulation effective enough to maintain survivable temperatures, even as the storm raged outside. "The heating elements?" Yulani said with wonder in her voice. She wired them incorrectly on purpose. The professor's antennae twitched with irritation. "That is not how Vellani technology is meant to function," he said. "Clearly the human does not care how it was meant to function." Yulani replied, "She only cares that it works." The storm lasted for 32 hours. Jisoo slept in short intervals, and she woke each time. The wind gusted particularly hard, and she checked her walls and her roof and her bracing. Twice she had to reinforce sections that were starting to fail. Once she had to plug a new gap that had opened in the wall with more of her foam paste. But she survived. When the storm finally passed and the wind died down and the dust settled, Jisoo pushed open her makeshift door and stepped outside. Her cabin was still standing. It was battered and covered in dust, and one section of the roof had shifted out of alignment, but it had survived the storm. Jisoo looked at her ugly asymmetrical shelter and she felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you, grandmother," she whispered. Then she took a deep breath and she went to check on her remaining materials. There was still work to do. The junk pile had been scattered by the storm, and materials she had carefully sorted were now spread across the plain. She would need to gather them again, and she would need to repair the damage to her cabin, and she would need to prepare for whatever came next. But she was alive. She had survived the storm that was supposed to kill her, and she had 4 more days to prove that humanity deserved a place among the stars. Professor Felix Tarn stared at the observation screen, and his mandibles hung open in an expression that Yulani had never seen from a Methri before. "She survived," he said, and his voice was flat with disbelief. "She did." Yulani confirmed, "Her methods are unconventional, but they appear to be effective." The professor was silent for a long moment, and then his mandibles clicked together sharply. "The test is not over," he said. 4 days remain, and there are other challenges she has not yet faced." But something had changed in his voice, something that sounded almost like doubt. Professor Felix Tarn watched the human through the observation drone, and he did not understand what he was seeing. The first day had passed, and the human had not built anything. She had not even tried to create shelter from the harsh environment. Instead, she had spent the entire day sorting through the junk pile and organizing materials into separate categories. "What is she doing?" asked Coordinator Yulani, who had joined him in the observation room aboard the station orbiting the moon. "Wasting time?" the professor answered with a dismissive click of his mandibles. Previous candidates began construction immediately, and they all failed, but at least they understood the urgency of their situation. Yulani's silver tentacles rippled in a gesture that indicated thoughtful disagreement. "Perhaps she has a different approach," the Silthine suggested. The professor did not respond because he was watching the human talk to herself. She walked among the piles of sorted materials, and she spoke out loud, as if she were having a conversation with someone who was not there. His translator picked up fragments of her words, but they made little sense to him. She said things like, "This one is too brittle, but it would work for insulation. And these casings are the right size. If I stack them offset, and grandmother would have used this for the roof." She speaks to herself, the professor noted with distaste. A sign of mental instability, perhaps, or a thinking process. Yulani offered. Some species vocalize their thoughts to organize them more effectively. The second day began, and the human finally started to build. But she did not build in any way that made sense to Professor Felix Tarn. She cleared a flat area of ground, and then she began laying down a foundation using the dead Krishi power cells. The casings were roughly rectangular, and she arranged them in interlocking rows like primitive construction blocks. Those are power cells, the professor said, and his antennae twitched with confusion. They are meant to store energy, not to serve as building materials. They are empty power cells, Yulani pointed out. The casings are made of thermal ceramic, and they appear to be quite sturdy. The human continued her work, and the professor watched with growing bewilderment as she transformed broken technology into construction materials. She took the methery hull plating that had cracked in the atmospheric exposure, and she discovered that the cracks made the material more flexible. She layered the cracked plates together and created thick insulated panels that she propped against her foundation walls. She found cables that still conducted electricity, and she wove them together into rope that she used to bind her materials in place. She took the support struts from the Dranaki cargo hauler, and she bent them further using rocks as leverage until they formed the skeleton of a roof frame by the end of the second day. She had the basic structure of a small shelter. It was ugly. It was asymmetrical and rough, and it looked like something a child might build from scraps in a junkyard. The professor made detailed notes about the structural weaknesses. He observed and he calculated that the shelter would collapse within hours of any significant stress. She is failing, he announced with satisfaction. The structure is inadequate. Yulani studied the image on the observation screen, and her tentacles formed a pattern that indicated uncertainty. It does not look like Covenant construction, she admitted, but it does look like something. It looks like garbage assembled by a primitive mind. The professor declared. Down on the surface of the moon, Park Jisoo stood back and examined her work. The shelter was small and it was far from finished, but it was taking shape. She thought about the homes in her grandmother's village and how they had been built from local materials using techniques passed down through generations. Those homes had not looked like the gleaming towers of Seoul, but they had kept people warm and safe for hundreds of years. She picked up the cracked Sylphine meditation sphere that she had found buried in the junk pile. It was made of a transparent material that had not shattered. Despite the crack running through its center, she held it up to catch the light, and she smiled. "You will make a perfect window," she said to it. The night cycle came, and the temperature dropped rapidly. Jisoo had prepared for this by creating a small enclosed space within her half-finished shelter. She wrapped herself in layers of methery insulation, and she activated the heating elements she had salvaged from the Villani navigation console. The elements were designed to regulate temperature in a sophisticated computer system, but Jisoo had discovered that if she wired them incorrectly, they produced heat instead of absorbing it. A Villani engineer would have been horrified by this misuse of their technology. Jisoo was simply grateful to be warm. She ate a ration bar from the small supply she had been given, and she drank carefully from her water container. 7 days of survival meant 7 days of rationing, and she could not afford to be careless with her resources. Outside her shelter, the wind picked up, and dust began to swirl across the plain. Jisoo watched through the gaps in her walls, and she saw something on the horizon that made her breath catch in her throat. A storm was coming. She could see it building in the distance like a wall of brown and gray that stretched from the ground to the sky. The professor had not warned her about storms. She should have known that he would not. "Okay," she whispered to herself as she watched the storm grow larger. "Okay, we can handle this." She did not sleep that night. Instead, she worked by the dim light of a salvaged power cell, and she reinforced her walls, and she thought about her grandmother. Her grandmother had survived a war and a famine and decades of hardship, and she had never stopped building and never stopped fighting. "Keep fighting," Jisoo muttered as her hands moved over the rough materials. "Keep fighting." In the observation room, Professor Felix Tarn noted the approaching storm, and he felt a cold satisfaction settle in his thorax. The storm would arrive by midday tomorrow, and it would last for at least 30 hours. No previous candidate had survived such a storm. The human would fail, and Earth would be denied. Covenant membership and the natural order of the galaxy would be preserved. Primitive species did not belong among the civilized worlds. That was simply the way things were. Park Jisoo stood in the massive examination hall of the Galactic Integration Academy and tried not to show her fear on her face. The hall was built for species much larger than humans, and the ceiling stretched so high above her head that she could barely see where it ended. Around her stood delegates from a dozen different worlds, and every single one of them looked at her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open contempt. She was the first human to ever stand in this hall, and she knew that the fate of her entire species rested on what happened in the next 7 days. Professor Felix Starn clicked his mandibles together as he reviewed the data tablet in his 4 hands. He was a Methri, and his kind had been members of the Covenant of Civilized Worlds for over 10,000 years. His exoskeleton was a deep purple color that shifted to black at the joints, and his compound eyes reflected Jisoo's image back at her in 100 tiny fragments. The human candidate will now receive her evaluation assignment, he announced to the assembled observers. His voice was cold and precise and carried no emotion that Jisoo could identify. Coordinator Yulani stepped forward with a gentle wave of her silver tentacles. She was a Silthene, and her species was known throughout the galaxy for their diplomatic nature and their genuine curiosity about all forms of life. Perhaps we should explain the purpose of this evaluation first, Yulani suggested in a voice like flowing water. Professor Felix Starn made a sharp clicking sound that Jisoo's translator rendered as dismissive disagreement. The purpose is obvious, he said, and turned his compound eyes toward Jisoo with an intensity that made her want to step backward. Your species wishes to join the Covenant, and the Covenant does not accept primitives. Jisoo felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice calm when she spoke. I understand that the evaluation is meant to test whether humanity is ready for membership, she said, and met the professor's gaze without flinching. I am prepared to do whatever is required. The professor's mandibles clicked again, in what might have been amusement or might have been contempt. We shall see, he said, and gestured toward a doorway that had just opened in the far wall of the hall. Come with me, and I will show you what is required. They traveled by shuttle to a small moon that orbited a gas giant in an uninhabited system. Jisoo watched through the viewport as the barren surface came into view, and she felt her stomach drop at the sight of it. The moon was gray and brown and utterly lifeless. Dust storms swirled across its surface, and she could see no water and no vegetation and no sign that anything had ever lived there. This is Evaluation Site 7, Professor Felix Starn announced as the shuttle descended toward a flat plain near the moon's equator. The atmosphere is thin but breathable, and the temperature fluctuates between extreme heat during the day cycle and extreme cold during the night cycle. Jisoo nodded and committed these details to memory. What resources will I have access to? She asked. The professor made that clicking sound again, and this time Jisoo was certain it was amusement. You will see, he said. The shuttle landed and the ramp extended, and Jisoo stepped out onto the surface of the moon. The air was thin, and she had to breathe deeply to get enough oxygen, but it was indeed breathable. The ground beneath her feet was hard-packed dust and small rocks, and nothing else. And then she saw the pile. It was massive, and it stretched across the plain like a small mountain. Broken ship components and defunct machinery and cracked power cells and twisted metal beams and shattered screens and cables and pipes and panels and pieces of technology from species she had never seen before. All of it was junk. All of it was broken. This is your resource allocation, Professor Felix Starn said, and Jisoo could hear the satisfaction in his translated voice. Materials from 17 different species, and none of it functional, and none of it designed to work together. Jisoo walked toward the pile and picked up a piece of hull plating that was covered in strange symbols. What am I supposed to do with this? She asked. Survive, The professor answered, "For 1 standard week. You must remain on this moon using only these materials and whatever you can make from them. And if you succeed, then humanity will be considered for Covenant membership." Jisoo turned to face him, and she saw in his compound eyes that he expected her to fail. He wanted her to fail. This test was not designed to evaluate her species, but to prove that humans were not worthy of joining the galactic community. "Is there any combination of these materials that you would consider cheating?" she asked. The professor tilted his head in a gesture that her translator identified as confusion. "Explain your question," he demanded. "I mean, if I use these materials in ways they were not intended to be used, or if I combine things that were never meant to go together, would that disqualify me from the evaluation?" Professor Felix Tarn considered this for a long moment, and his mandibles clicked softly as he thought. "No." He finally said, "You may use anything in this pile in any manner you choose, and there are no restrictions on methodology." Jisoo smiled, and it was a smile that made the professor's antennae twitch with an emotion he could not quite identify. "Thank you for clarifying," she said, and turned back to face the mountain of alien junk. The shuttle lifted off behind her, and she did not watch it go. Instead, she walked to the edge of the pile and began to examine the materials more closely. She found methery hull plating that was cracked and discolored but still structurally sound. She found power cells from a species called the Kreshi that were completely dead, but had casings made of a dense ceramic material. She found heating elements from a Volani navigation console that sparked when she touched them together. She found support struts from a Dranaki cargo hauler that were bent but not broken. She found insulation foam from a dozen different sources and cables that still conducted electricity and transparent. Spheres that might have been meditation aids or might have been windows, and she found something else. Something that made her laugh out loud in the thin air of this barren moon. She found a manual. It was written in Volani script, and her translator could only render about half of it, but the pictures were clear enough. It showed Volani homes and how they were built and the materials they used and the methods they employed. Jisoo sat down on a piece of broken machinery and looked at the manual, and then looked at the pile of junk, and then looked at the empty plain around her. In 7 days, she would either prove that humanity deserved a place among the stars, or she would die alone on this moon, and her species would be rejected from the Covenant forever. She thought about her grandmother, who had grown up in a small village in the Korean mountains. Her grandmother had taught her how to build things from whatever was available, and how to make do with what you had, and how to never give up no matter how impossible the task seemed. "Okay, grandmother," Jisoo whispered to herself as she stood up and rolled her shoulders. "Let us see what we can build." She got to work.